Explaining different forms of rationality gives the impression that each form of rationality also has its own logic, but this is not the case. Logic is logic. There are no different types of arguments. There are just different basic requirements regarding the axioms, the basic values. Equally absurd is the assertion of rationalities that each have their own principles and their own coherence, as Welsch believes. Principles or axioms are one thing, consistency, i.e. logic, is another. Statements such as, "No type of rationality can be the measure for all others," or, "Rationality with a different logic but with the same internal law," only come about through a mix-up or by equating premise and derivation and would not be possible without this. It is also nonsense to talk about the equality of different forms of knowledge that replace a hierarchical order. Because you are not dealing with different logic that is used in different areas of knowledge, but always with claims that are logical or those which are not, in relation to different premises. The starting positions are different and cannot be interchanged at will. But the fact that a view should be consistent with its starting points is a necessity in order to be able to talk reasonable about a thing. Otherwise you can no longer stick to anything because the opposite can be said every 5 minutes without any consequence. At most, equal ranking are those values that are accepted as fundamental and come into play as a result of a decision and are not the result of objective knowledge. But only if a higher authority exists that can guarantee any rights at all. Whether someone declares art or politics to be the content of their life is of equal importance. This is what gives freedom of choice. There is no logically common standard between art and politics that makes the two comparable. However, the degree of commitment and the commitment with which someone sticks to their own principles are not equal of rank. As soon as a norm applies, there is an obligation to follow it, regardless of the club you are in. It makes no sense to constantly negotiate truth and ethical norms, as Lyotard demands. The demand that every situation must have its own rules may also have practical limits. Rules or legal norms can only provide the direction for making judgments in the spirit of a regulation. If every detail had its own rule, it would result in a library of paragraphs from here to the moon. That's precisely why we set common goals and set common rules so that we don't have to constantly discuss everything because we've already agreed on something. It is a very simple economic calculation that not everything has to be questioned again and again because certain things have been decided. Over time, these decisions may turn out to be outdated and require improvement, but until a decision has been made about correcting the old rules, what is written in the statutes applies. If Lyotard considers a large number of different language games to be so important because he does not want the game to freeze under homogeneous rules, but rather to remain constantly in motion, then this only makes sense with regard to the axioms, because there can be no common logic for them anyway. If someone, according to his moral principles, considers freedom to be higher than equality, then the two are not comparable in a principled sense. But they are comparable in a certain situation in which the special circumstances influence the judgment in such a way that the decision is either in favor of freedom or justice, because one or the other is more correct. Nevertheless, one can say that in situations in which the arguments for and against freedom are fairly balanced, one person will lean more towards freedom than equality and another will lean more towards justice and less towards freedom. Reason is involved when the rules of consistency are observed. No matter what starting point you come from, the game is not fair if everyone is allowed to play, because everyone will not be able or willing to play always and everywhere. The game is only as fair as it can be when everyone can play, wherever he or she or whoever wants to play, and the appropriate conditions for this are also available. Lyotard makes no distinction between heterogeneity and incommensurability. His idea of diversity and plurality is the result of a sensitivity to the incommensurable. But incommensurability has nothing to do with sensitivity. The logical incompatibility of different things that do not belong to the same level can be understood rationally. Unless one no longer wants to know anything about a consistency in thinking or a logical contradiction anyway. If Lyotard considers a large number of different language games to be so important because he does not want the game to freeze under homogeneous rules, but rather to remain constantly in motion, then this only makes sense with regard to the axioms, because there can be no common logic for them anyway. If someone, according to his moral principles, considers freedom to be higher than equality, then the two are not comparable in a principled sense. But they are comparable in a certain situation in which the special circumstances influence the judgment in such a way that the decision is either in favor of freedom or justice, because one or the other is more correct. Nevertheless, one can say that in situations in which the arguments for and against freedom are fairly balanced, one person will lean more towards freedom than equality, and another will lean more towards justice and less towards freedom. Reason is involved when the rules of consistency are observed. No matter what starting point you come from, the game is not fair if everyone is allowed to play, because everyone will not be able or willing to play always and everywhere. The game is only as fair as it can be when everyone can play, wherever he or she or whoever wants to play, and the appropriate conditions for this are also available. Lyotard makes no distinction between heterogeneity and incommensurability. His idea of diversity and plurality is the result of a sensitivity to the incommensurable. But incommensurability has nothing to do with sensitivity. The logical incompatibility of different things that do not belong to the same level can be understood rationally. Unless one no longer wants to know anything about a consistency in thinking or a logical contradiction anyway. The logical incommensurability of the individual and generality can only be denied if it is denied that a thing can only exist once, and not a second time, that is, if it is denied that something unmistakable, unique is even possible. But there is no plausible argument for this. Nevertheless, in the foreseeable future it will not be possible to convince an overwhelming majority of people that logical thinking has its definite rational limits. So pseudo-rational realism and its consequences will have to be expected for quite a long time. The reasons why someone does not understand the principle of incommensurability can be varied, and ultimately what Hegel declares to be the inviolable right of every individual also applies. Not to accept anything that one does not consider to be reasonable. The power-political usefulness of logical universality is undisputed, because it creates a higher law that significantly reduces inconsistent subjective interests. The only question is whether this is really in the interests of individual human beings. There are many practical reasons for a pragmatic connection between word and thing, as many as there are interests, needs or wishes, but they are all more or less arbitrary, i.e., the result of a personal decision and not necessary for to be thought in only one way and no other. In relation to these arbitrarinesses, i.e. in relation to the principle of freedom, pluralism is the most normal thing in the world, but not when it comes to the question of whether I contradict myself or not. In this case here are only two options. The real problem is not the contradiction, in itself, and being right across all borders, but rather the violation of one's own principles. The principle of not contradicting one's own premises, no matter what the premises are, is a principle with supra-individual validity, without which it no longer makes sense to communicate with anyone at all. Of course, you can't force anyone to be logical or rational. But it must be possible to criticize someone for not being logical, as I said, not in regard to things in themselves, but with regard to one's own axioms, if you will. This is the one common language that reasonable people speak at all. That doesn't mean that everyone always has to think logically, and consequently, a certain amount of nonsense, humor, smugness, sarcasm, satire, or even cynicism can sometimes be very amusing and a form of expression between the lines, so to speak. Likewise, the feelings that are always described as irrational from an absolutely objectivist point of view have their justification if they occur at the right time and in the right place. It also should be up to each individual to judge whether this is the case. When Lyotard emphasizes that the otherness of the other person lies precisely in the fact that it is fundamentally different from oneself, then he should add, fundamental with regard to a logic that wants to be absolute, but not fundamental with regard to the interests and needs of people. There are a lot of similarities, which also come about on a voluntary basis. Lyotard wants to remove the ground from any attempt at integration that seeks to destroy diversity. Justice should be done to the unpredictable, the incomprehensible, the unidentifiable, the suppressed, the unspeakable, the buried, the unmentioned, the omitted, the hidden. But this only makes sense in a campaign against the identity pressure of a uniform logic. But not when it comes to enabling people to pursue their own interests and fulfill their needs. That is the real task. Once logocentrism has been put in its place to the extent that it only has a secondary importance, we won't be able to get rid of the inappropriate standardization completely for the time being. The centralistic logic is too deeply rooted in people's habits of thought and language. Lyotard thinks so too. Ultimately, however, logical absolutism should also go the way of kings and gods and have less and less importance in the lives of reasonable people. Only then can one justifiably speak of the better argument that prevails in the end. Until then, the myth of rational reasoning is nothing more than a successful attempt at deception. For Lyotard, what is ethically primary is the protection of the incommensurabilities of language games, but without a differentiation between logical incompatibility and heterogeneous interests. Many possible commonalities are unnecessarily made impossible. Without such commonalities, however, no authority can be established that could provide any kind of protection. Once the abolition of absolutism has arrived in the minds of the intelligent elites and the relativization of former absolutes has become normal, then it is important to put these conditions into an adequate political form, that is, to create the famous framework conditions that prevent that a fraudulent generality continues to cheat people. What is then ethically primary is the legitimation of power interests, which can no longer be justified on the basis of given facts. The heterogeneity of language games propagated by Lyotard is no longer valid the moment a distinction is made between logical incommensurability and the heterogeneity of interests. Ways of living are not incommensurable unless they are compared via an absolute logic. Ways of living can get along with one another even if one does not share their own, possibly contradictory, logic. There can still be common interests, for example in an overarching order that enables different ways of life. What, on the other hand, causes nothing but confusion is the view with which every language game is given its own rationality, not in the sense of an internal logic. but as a from the individual independent kind of logical generality. Such a confusion of terms, through which one can suddenly talk about a scientific theoretical, a moral legal, an aesthetic and possibly a religious rationality, makes just as little sense as it does to speak about German physics, or an epistemology of the South. If something like an overarching reason can be justified at all, then it is the principle of logical consistency, with regard to one's own presuppositions, i.e. internal logical consistency. Because without this there can be no common order. Without a principle of communication like this, the law of the jungle and mental limitation will prevail. The late Canadian historian of philosophy Barry Stroud is reported to have said that the practical and social consequences of a consistent epistemologically skeptical position are indeed disastrous. If one substitutes logical incommensurability for consistently skeptical, then I certainly agree that the practical and social implications would be enormous if seriously considered. But not disastrous, provided one does not confuse incommensurability with heterogeneity, as Lyotard does. Exact logic doesn't play that big of a role in most people's daily lives anyway. Practical, useful activities have priority. As a rule, logical thoughts only arise when there are conflicts of interest. Where an attempt is made to reach an understanding on the basis of a mutually accepted rule, but this often fails. The logic of generality has always been an instrument of power, order and security that should make the use of physical force unnecessary. If Lyotard believes that he can simply switch from an attitude oriented towards controlling people to completely throwing the principle of logical consistency overboard, then he is vastly underestimating the uncontrolled abuse of power, no less than Habermas was overestimating the establishment of ideal speaking situations. So you don't have to agree with Lyotard when he fundamentally rejects any supra-individual norm. Maybe he doesn't do that at all and just rejects every decision that is made over people's heads. His position in terms of legitimacy is not really clear. In the language games he leaves the rules to the players. But who are the players? For instance, in an economic discourse, Lyotard rejects consensus as an overarching principle because it is usually manipulated and abused as a means of power. However, he accepts a consensus within a language game if this consensus is local and is achieved by current players. In addition, this local consensus must be revocable at any time. In Lyotard, there is also the possibility of linking together disparately heterogeneous systems of rules with a view to a specified purpose when two parties agree on the meaning of a certain concept. When Lyotard defines struggle as the essence of the language game, he wants it to be understood as a playful competition in which the main aim is to promote new ideas. But the real fight is more likely to be waged against the absolutists, against the apostles of logical universality who strive for world domination with their objectivism and realism. The differend must be witnessed against these people. Lyotard sees dialogue as a form of violence, but this applies primarily to centralist thinking absolutists. Within a language game, it makes little sense to describe dialogue as violence unless someone is forced into a language game. The principle of the language game becomes problematic when no precautions are taken to prevent one language game from having unjustified advantages over others. For example, when the economic discourse is forced on language players of other discourses who are not involved in determining the rules of the game. If Lyotard fundamentally rejects any higher authority that would be able to judge the individual language games, the economic discourse in particular makes clear the need for an overarching ethical order. Anyone who, like Lyotard, is interested in the principle of justice cannot avoid a higher authority.